Hey everyone, what's up? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Lamed Vav of Masechta Pesachim, Daf 36. It's a cool daf. We're talking about essentially different things that you can use for making matzah. So we start off exploring whether you could make matzah from mayser shayni. Then we discuss whether you can make matzah from, if you could knead the dough with wine, oil, or honey. We got into that a little bit yesterday. We will go further today. Yeah, let's just say that. Matzah of bikurim. Can you make matzah from like grain that was bikurim? I guess that would be specifically wheat or barley, because bikurim is the first fruits that is limited to the Shiva Saminim. And then at the end we have a little discussion about if you can eat bikurim when you are in onain. We will get to that a little bit later. Well, let us begin. We're on Daf Lamed Vav Mud Aleph, about 6 lines into the page. Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Yachol Yotzei Adam Yidei Chavasu b'mayser shayni b'Yushalayim. Aha! Can a person make matzahs with mayser shayni in Yerushalayim? What does that mean? So of course we all know that mayser shayni is that you have a field. We discussed it yesterday also, a shtickle. You have a field and you harvest the field. 2% you give to the Kohen, that's truma. Then you take 10% from what remains, that is mayser rishon. Then you take another 10%, and that is mayser shayni. And this mayser shayni you bring to Yerushalayim, and you have to eat it in Yerushalayim. Okay. So can you taste? So let's say you have wheat, and you separate the mayser shayni, you bring it to Yerushalayim. Can you use that wheat to make? Can you grind it up into flour and make matzahs? So Talmudom lechem oni. So the pasuk says lechem oni, mashenechol ba'aninus. Interesting. You see what happened there? Yotzeh she'enu nechol ba'aninus ala b'simcha divrei Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Rabbi Yossi Aglili says, in the context of matzah, it says lechem oni. Now, lechem oni, there's all sorts of ways you can learn it, right? Bread of affliction, poor man's bread, lechem she'onin olav dvarim harbe, as we're going to see in a few minutes. There's all sorts of things you can do with lechem oni. What Rabbi Yossi Aglili does with it, which is very interesting, is he says, oni, even though it's written with an ayin, it's as if you can say, let's treat it as if it's written with an aleph, which is like onain. What's an onain? Well, of course we remember from the third parak of Masechta Brachos what an onain is. An onain is somebody whose relative passed away, so before the relative is buried, so that period between when the person passed away and when they are buried is what's called aninus, as opposed to avelus. So when you are an onain, so you won't eat mayser shayni, as it says lo achalti ba'oni mimenu, that I didn't eat from the mayser shayni when I was an onain. So therefore it says lechem oni. Rabbi Yossi Aglili wants to say that lechem oni is lechem that you can eat even as an onain, to the exclusion of mayser shayni, which you would be unable to eat as an onain, and therefore you cannot make matzahs from mayser shayni, because then you would not be allowed to eat those matzahs as an onain. So let's read that again. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Yachol Yotzei Adam Yidei Chavasu b'mayser shayni b'Yerushalayim. Is it possible that a person can, go to Yerushalayim, schlep his wheat, that's mayser shayni, to Yerushalayim, grind up the wheat, make it into flour, and then make matzahs with that mayser shayni wheat? That would be a good idea, l'mayser, right? When you have a guy, he has wheat in his field, he figures, I have a great idea. I'm going to Yerushalayim for Pesach, let me schlep all this wheat as my mayser shayni, and I'll use that to make my matzahs. But no, I don't know. Rabbi Yossi Aglili is not into that. He says, no, Talmud Lomar, it says, lechem oni, mashenechol ba'aninus, it has to be, the matzahs have to be edible, even as an onain, yotzeh zeh, to the exclusion of matzahs made with mayser shayni flour, she'enu nechol ba'aninus el b'simcha divrei Rabbi Yossi Aglili, that would be unable to be eaten by an onain. You have to specifically eat mayser shayni b'simcha, and therefore you cannot use mayser shayni flour for matzahs. Rabbi Akiva Omer Says Rabbi Akiva, matzos riba. Says Rabbi Akiva, as we learned this drasha yesterday, that in the context of matzah, it says matzahs twice. So to include, what's it coming to include? Says Rabbi Akiva, it's including mayser shayni, that you are allowed to make matzahs from flour of mayser shayni. Well, if that's the case of Rabbi Akiva, then why does it say lechem oni? Rabbi Yossi Aglili said it says lechem oni to say, right, to essentially exclude mayser shayni. So what does Rabbi Akiva do with lechem oni? Prad le'isa shenilosha b'yayin v'shemen udvash. To the exclusion of bread, of dough, that was kneaded with wine, oil, or honey. That if it was kneaded with wine, or oil, or honey, so then you would be unable to use that for matzahs. Let's go weiter for a second. My time with Rabbi Akiva. How come Rabbi Akiva says that you would be unable to use this dough that was kneaded with wine, oil, or honey? So miksiv lechem oni ksiv. Well, the pasuk. So interestingly, the pasuk, when it says lechem oni, it's written lechem ani. It's written without a vav. Now, an ani is a poor person. So therefore, Rabbi Akiva says, look, you have to understand lechem oni not as bread that can be eaten even as an onin, like Rabbi Yossi Aglili wants to say. Rather, lechem oni like lechem ani, poor man's bread. And therefore, that excludes dough that was kneaded with oil, wine, or honey, because that is rich man's bread, what's called lechem ashira, matzah ashira. So therefore, you would be unable to use it. It has to be poor man's bread. Rabbi Yossi Aglili, mi karinon oni karinon. Rabbi Yossi Aglili says, yeah, granted, it's written without a vav. It's written ani, but we read it in practice oni. And therefore, he makes the drasha. Oni is like an onain, that it has to be of a product. It has to be a product that you can eat even as an onain. Rabbi Akiva, Hai the Karinan Bei Oni Kedishmo. Rabbi Akiva responds and he says, yeah, I'm aware of the fact that even though it's written ani, we read it oni. But what I do with that is like what Shmuel says, to Amar Shmuel, although interestingly, Shmuel was obviously much later than Rabbi Akiva, but meaning we're saying in practice what Rabbi Akiva learns from oni is like we see that Shmuel said later, which is lechem oni, lechem she'onin olav dvarim harbe. It's bread that we say all sorts of things about. And interestingly, la'anot is to answer, right? So, my initial assumption was that, yeah, lechem she'onin olav dvarim harbe. Bread that we answer all sorts of things about, that we have the 4 questions, the manashtana, we have the 4 children, right? And they'll ask questions and you'll answer. I figure that that's what it's talking about, the dialogue of the Seder. So it's close, but Rashi actually says, she'onin olav dvarim, she'gomrim olav es halal, that you say halal on it, on this matzah, v'omrim olav haggadah, and you say the haggadah. Meaning Rashi doesn't really say anything about questions and answers here. He says, these are matzahs that we basically say a lot of things about, right? We'll say halal, we'll say the entire haggadah on these matzahs. So that is what Rabbi Akiva learns from lechem oni, that it's this bread that we say all sorts of things about. And the fact that it's written ani is how we exclude matzahs that were kneaded with wine, oil, or honey. Very interesting stuff. V'sav Rabbi Akiva, isa shenilosha b'yayin v'shemen udvash lo? But one second. Does Rabbi Akiva really say that you would be unable to eat matzahs that were kneaded with wine, oil, or honey? V'atanya. But we learn in a brayso. Ein loshen isa v'pesach b'yayin v'shemen udvash v'im lo shem gamliel omer tisarif miyad v'chacham om ye'achol. Let's read that again. V'atanya. We learn in a brayso. Ein loshen isa v'pesach b'yayin v'shemen udvash. Okay. So says the Tanakama over here, who's Rabbi Gamliel, that on Pesach you would be unable to take a dough, knead it with wine, oil, or honey, and then use that for matzah. You cannot do that. Ve'im lash, and if you did knead the dough with wine, oil, or honey, Rabbi Gamliel omer tisarif miyad. Rabbi Gamliel says you have to burn it immediately, and that's because wine, oil, or honey will make it chametz very, very fast. And because it'll make it chametz very, very fast, you have to push it, burn it immediately. Whereas the chachamim say, Ya'achol. Chachamim say it's no problem. just be careful. Make sure that the bread doesn't become, that the matzah doesn't become chametz. As long as you're careful, you could make the dough with wine, oil, or honey and enjoy the matzah. Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Akiva said, Shabbos Ya'isa, Eitzer Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Akiva says, one time I was spending Pesach with Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua, V'loshti loim isa b'yayin v'shemen udvash, and I needed for them a dough for matzahs, and I used wine, oil, and honey. V'lo amru li davar, and they didn't say anything to me. So we see Rabbi Akiva saying that he ate matzahs that were needed with wine, oil, or honey. So, or maybe wine, oil, and honey. Maybe it's all of it together, but definitely not just simple water. So, on the one hand, we're saying that Rabbi Akiva excludes this dough that was needed with wine, oil, and honey, because it wouldn't be considered lechem oni, it wouldn't be poor man's bread. Yet we have Rabbi Akiva himself saying how he made matzahs with dough that was needed with wine, oil, and honey. Okay, now the Brisa continues. Now, according to Rabbi Gamliel, who says that if you needed a dough with wine, oil, and honey, you'd have to burn it immediately. But even Rabbi Gamliel admits that even though you wouldn't be able to knead a dough with wine, oil, and honey, you can take like a brush and kind of paint it on the top. I don't know what that's called, but it's like some kind of baking hack where you can like take like egg and stuff and you like brush it on the top. Okay, so even Rabbi Gamliel says that you can do that with wine, oil, and honey, even though you can't knead with it. The Chacham say, "Es shaloshin bo mekatfin bo, ves shein loshin bo ein mekatfin bo." Oh, the Chacham are more kind of binary. They're more black and white. If you can knead with it, you can paint it onto the top. If you can't knead with it, you cannot brush it onto the top. Okay, very cool. Vishavan, it continues the Brisa, that both Rabbi Gamliel and the Chacham admit, they agree, shein loshin es ha'isha b'poshin, that you're not allowed to knead dough with lukewarm water because that will make it rise super diddy-ooper quick. And even the Chacham who say that dough that was kneaded with wine, oil, or honey, just be careful and then enjoy it, they would say that you'd be unable to knead the dough with lukewarm water because that would make it rise very, very quick. And even they would say it's not allowed. Okay, no, so going back to our question. How come on the one hand Rabbi Akiva is saying that you're not allowed to knead dough with wine, oil, or honey for matzahs, and yet we see that he did it? That right, he kneaded dough with wine, oil. I keep on saying or and. Honestly, I'm not sure if it's or and. I assume it's probably neither. I assume you probably would be unable to knead dough. Assuming that you're not allowed to use these ingredients, you'd probably not be able to use any of them. But Rabbi Akiva is reporting that it sounds like he kneaded the dough with all of them, I guess. So what's the deal? According to Rabbi Akiva, are you allowed to do this? Are you not allowed to do this? So lo kasha, it's no problem. Habi yom tov rishon, habi yom tov shayni. So there, listen to that. You hear that? It depends if it's the first night or not. If we're talking about the first night of Pesach, where there's a chiyuv to eat matzah, you mamish have to eat matzah on the first night of Pesach. So in that case, use lechem oni, right? Make sure that it's poor man's bread. Make sure that it was not kneaded with wine, oil, or honey. But habi yom tov sheni. But after that, once the first night is over, you already satisfied your obligation to eat matzah on the first night, then you can make matzahs with wine, oil, and honey, and that would be no problem. Kedamalu Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi livnei Yom Akama lo talushu li bechelva mikan velech lushu li bechelva. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said to his children, he said, look, on the first night of Pesach, do not put milk into the dough, into the matzah dough. But after that, put milk into the matzah dough. It'll make it really delicious. But everyone's of course remembering the Gemara from Daf Lamed, which says that I thought that we don't make baked goods, we don't make bread with milk because we're concerned that people might eat it with milk, with meat. No, so rather, this is what Rabbi Shimon ben Levi was telling his children. On the first night, do not put honey in the dough. So we see over here, by the way, also that we're saying honey alone and not just with wine and oil. So on the first night, don't put honey in the dough because it needs to be lechem oni. Mikan ve'elach, but from then on, lushali beduvsha, you can put honey in the dough. So there you have it. That there's a distinction between the first night and the other nights. V'bay sema, or if you want, I will say, what's the deal with the milk? The olam bechelva kedam ravina kein Torah shari hachanami kein Torah. So, or you can even say that no, Rabbi Shimon ben Levi was saying milk, meaning on the first night, leave the milk out of the dough. On the rest of the Pesach, you include milk in the dough. But how can you put milk into dough? Well, because we're talking about like a donut, I don't know, or a little roll, right? We're talking about if you make ke'en Torah, like the size of a bull's eye, okay, a bullseye, I guess. If you make some kind of bread the size of a bullseye, so then you could put dairy into that because you're just going to eat it quickly and you won't eat it with meat. Very interesting. Now, if you're wondering, what's the deal? How come over here we're talking about using wine, oil, and honey to make matzah, and if that works or not, and nobody's concerned about what we said yesterday, that according to Reish Lakish, you're not chayiv karis if you eat dough of wine, oil, and honey that is chametz, you're not chayiv karis, and as Ravida Bar Oven said, because mayperis and machmitzin, because these would be considered mayperis, wine, oil, and honey would be considered fruit juice, and fruit juice can't actually make chametz. Well, if they're not machmitzin, then how can you be using it for matzahs? Nobody seems to be considerate about this, right? According to Bekiva, he says you can make matzahs with mayperis. So, right, and according to Rabbi Gamliel, he says you have to burn it immediately because it's going to become chametz. So, like, what's the deal? So, it's a question. I'm not going to get into it because I didn't go into it enough to be able to give a proper answer, but I do really just want to say it's a question. It's a good question. And there's a whole Tosfos on it on Daf Lamed Hey Amud Beis. Rashi makes the distinction between maybe it's what's called chametz nuksha, which is kind of like a lower level chametz, whatever it is. But if you're wondering the question, it's a good question. And it requires a proper answer, which I did not get into. Vishavan shein lashon es ha'isha b'poshin. Oh, very good. So we just said that everyone agrees that both Rabbi Gamliel and the Chachamim agree that even though they argue regarding making matzah with wine, oil, or honey, everyone agrees that you're not allowed to make dough with lukewarm water because that will cause the dough to rise very quickly and it'll become chametz. So Mashnami menachos. Now the Gemara wants to know, why should matzahs be any different than menachos? The Tanan, as we learn in the Mishnah, called menachos niloshen b'poshen u'mishaman shelo yechamtzu. That by the menachos, by the flour offerings in the Beis HaMikdash, so interestingly, I wasn't aware of this, but there was a whole process when it comes to making korban menachos, these flour offerings. So let's say you have like a korban marcheshes or machavas or a maifetanor. These are different minchas that were like made in different kinds of pans. And so what they would do is, and it's come up like a little bit in the past, like in brachis and daf lamed ches, I think. Basically what they would do is they would take like flour, mix it with water, and then they would bake it, okay? And then after they would bake it, they would then break it up again, add oil and stuff, and then that's when they would take the fistful and put that on the mizbeach. So basically, the process is kind of like this. So the person bringing the offering would come to the Beis HaMikdash with some flour, the Kohen would then take the flour. No, that's not necessarily true, as we're going to see. Meaning, either the Kohen or even the person who's bringing the offering can take the flour, mix it with water, make some kind of a dough. They bake it, okay? So at this point it was already kneaded and everything like that and baked. They then take it out of the oven. They then break it up into like breadcrumbs or whatever. Matzah meal, I guess technically. And then they add oil to it. They mix it together. They take a fistful, a kometz, and they put that on the mizbeach. So it's like a whole process, and there's all sorts of steps. So now we're going to get into like different steps along the way and see what has to be done by a kohen, what can be done by anybody, what can be done by anybody. So anyway, so we're saying over here, so all the carbon minchas, so they get kneaded with lukewarm water, or they can be kneaded with lukewarm water. So this is talking about when you would knead it before you baked it, before you initially baked it. And then just be careful that they don't become chametz, because these were matzahs, right? In the Beis Hamikdash, the only times that there would be chametz in the Beis Hamikdash, if I'm not mistaken, was the shtei alechem, that the two breads that they would offer on Shavuos, as well as 10 of the 40 loaves of the Korban Toda. Everything else was unleavened, was matzahs. So be careful to make sure that this dough does not become chametz. Okay, no. So how come when it comes to matzahs are we saying that you're not allowed, everyone agrees that you're not allowed to use lukewarm water, yet when it comes to menachos we say you can use lukewarm water, just make sure it doesn't become chametz? So the Gemara answers, Imamu b'rizin, Yomu b'she'ein's reason. There's a humongous difference between matzahs and menachos. Menachos are done by kohanim. Kohanim's reasoning, as we've seen before, that Kohanim are very fastidious, they're very particular, and they're going to make sure that this dough, that the menachos does not become chametz. But every person makes his own matzahs, and therefore, when it comes to matzahs, we have to be more strict and say that you're not allowed to use lukewarm water, because it could make the dough into chametz much quicker. And since it's just, any random person making matzahs, we have to be more careful and say, don't use lukewarm water. Bichlal. If that's the case, milasis nami lasis. Well, if that's the case, that by the menachos, we are, it's done by the kohanim, and therefore we could be more lenient. Well, alama amar Abzera, amar Rabbi Bar Yirmiyah, amar Shmuel, chitin shel menachos, ein lotzin osan. But then why does Reb Zera say in the name of Rabbi Bar Yirmiyah, who says in the name of Shmuel, that wheat, chitin, shel menachos, of the korban minchas, ein lotzin osan. You're not allowed to do letisa. What's letisa? Letisa is that you take the, let's say, wheat, and you have these wheat berries, these wheat kernels, and you soak them. And then after you soak them, you could put them in the mortar, and you can grind them up and make them into a very good flour. So we're saying that when it comes to the menachos, don't do that. Don't soak the wheat berries, because they might become chametz. But what's the problem? If we're saying that, the kohanim are very particular and very careful, so let them also do this letisa, and they'll make sure that it doesn't become chametz. So the Gemara answers, well, lisha bezrizin isa, lesisa leisa bezrizin. So the Gemara says, well, the kneading is being done by the kohanim. Therefore, it can be done with lukewarm water, because they'll be careful to make sure it doesn't become chametz. But the letisa, soaking the wheat berries before making them into flour, that would be done by anybody. That can be done before you get to the Beis Hamikdash. You come to the Beis Hamikdash already with the flour. So whatever soaking you were doing before you even made it into flour was happening at home before then. So that is being done by anybody, and therefore, you would be unable to soak the wheat berries in water as part of the flour making process, because we have to be concerned that maybe it'll become chametz. But once you bring it to the Beis Hamikdash and now you're kneading the dough, you can use lukewarm water, because we're not concerned that it'll become chametz. Now, the Gemara says, but one second, Felicia mi'isa bezrizin, we were just now assuming that the kneading of the dough is being done by the kohanim, and that's why they'll make sure it doesn't become chametz. But is that really true that the kneading of the dough is done by the kohanim? V'yaksiv, but the pasuk says, V'yotzok alei Hashem v'gomer, v'vyeh el kohen. That it says that so meaning this is now Okay, so the Korban Mincha, the fellow brought the flour to the Beis HaMikdash. They mixed the flour with the water. They then baked it in the oven. They now, after it was baked, they then broke it up into like matzah meal. Now, v'yatza kaleh shemen, and now we pour oil on it and some frankincense, and then ve'eveh la kohen, and then he takes it, and I think they also mix it together. Then they take it to the kohen, and the kohen takes a fistful and puts it on the mizbeach. Mikmitza ve'elach mitzvahs kahuna. That only from that point and on, from the point of the kmitza, the fistful needs to be done by the kohen and put on the mizbeach. But up until then, limida yitzika uvlila sheksher b'chol adam, which teaches that the pouring of the oil onto the matzah meal and the mixing together, anybody could do that. Meaning, all of the steps up until that final part where the kohen takes a fistful and puts it on the mizbeach, that could really be done by anybody. Which means that the kneading of the dough, which was an earlier step, that they would knead the dough before they baked it, which then was before they then broke it up and added water, oil and frankincense and all that stuff. The baking, which came earlier, could be done by anybody. It doesn't have to be done by a kohen. So if the baking can be done by anybody, so shouldn't we be concerned? The baking and the kneading really can be done by anybody, so then shouldn't we be concerned that it might become chametz? Why are you allowed to use lukewarm water? So the Gemara answers, Lisha nehida bezrizin leisa b'makom bezrizin isa. Interesting. That when it comes to kneading of the dough, yes, granted, it doesn't have to be done by the kohen, but it does have to be done in the azar. It does have to be done in the azar. And therefore, because it's being done in the Beis HaMikdash, in the azara, so there's watchful eyes over there, and even though it can be done by anybody, we can assume that it's not going to become chametz because it's in a place where he's being observed. The Amar Mar, as we said elsewhere, blila ksher bizar, that once you've baked the mincha and now you've broken it up into matzah meal and you've added oil, so now the blila, the mixing together of the mincha, ksher bizar, is allowed to be done by a non-kohen. Chutz l'chomas azara psula. However, if you take it outside of the azara and you do this mixing outside of the azara, then it's psula. So we see that the kneading of the dough, even though it can be done by anybody, it's going to be done in the Beis HaMikdash, in the azara, and therefore you can assume that it is going to be kosher and not become chametz, even if you use lukewarm water. Lafuke l'sisa, to the exclusion of this l'sisa, which is a step that's done even before it even becomes flour. When you take the wheat berries at home and you're going to soak them so that you can then make good flour, that cannot be done de'ena bezrizin v'lo b'makom bezrizin. That it is not done by kohanim, it's done by anybody, and also it's not done in the Beis HaMikdash, you could do it at home. So therefore we say don't do that, don't soak it in water, because we're concerned it might become chametz. But now, one second. How come we're saying that l'sisa is not allowed by a mincha, but by the minchas ha'omer, right, which is brought on the second day of Pesach, you're allowed to do l'sisa? The Tanya is, we learn in the Brayso minchas ha'omer losis and osa v'tzov and osa. That we learn in the Brayso that by the minchas ha'omer, by the omer offering on the second day of Pesach, we're saying that you are allowed to do l'sisa. You're allowed to take the barley and soak it and then grind it and get a very good flour. So, tzibur shayni. So the Gemara answers, that's different because it was a public offering. Because it was a public offering, it was done under the observation of the Bezdin. Because the Bezdin is watching every step of the way, we could be assured that even the l'sisa, even the soaking of the barley in this case, would be acceptable, since they'll be very careful to make sure that nothing becomes chametz. However, in general, the l'sisa is not being done under the observation, under the scrutiny of the Bezdin, and therefore we have to be concerned that it can become chametz. But the lisha, the kneading and all that stuff is happening in the Beis HaMikdash itself, so therefore we can assume that, even if you use lukewarm water, it won't become chametz. We'll be very careful, and that would be acceptable. Very interesting. However, by matzahs on Pesach, which everybody does at their own house, so we have to be concerned that lukewarm water may lead to chametz matzahs, which we don't want. Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Yachol yotzei adam midei chavasu bikurim. Very beautiful question. Can a person make matzahs with flour of bikurim? So what's bikurim? Bikurim is the first fruits that when a person grows in his field, and he has the Shiva Saminim, the 7 species, which of course are, let's see if I know them, Chita, Saora, Geffen, Te'ena, Verimon, Zaysim, and Tamarim. So these 7 species, so the first of their fruits you bring to Jerusalem and you give a whole history discussion about Arami Ovid Avi, and we're in Egypt, now we're in Eretz Yisrael, and we have these delicious fruits. Here you go, these are the fruits. So, and you give them to the Kohen. So, if you bring your wheat and your barley of bikurim, can you bring them to Jerusalem, excuse me, and make them into matzos? So, Tamlom b'chomosh v'seichem, tochlu matzos. Matzah nechelas b'chomosh v'seichem. Yotzu bikurim she'nechalim b'chomosh v'seichem el b'Yerushalayim deviri Rabbi Yossi HaGlili. Let's read that again. So it says b'chomosh v'seichem tochlu matzos, that you have to be able to eat matzos anywhere. Matzos hanechelas b'chomosh v'seichem. Yotzu bikurim she'nechalim b'chomosh v'seichem el b'Yerushalayim, to the exclusion of bikurim, which you cannot eat anywhere. You have to dafka eat them in Yerushalayim deviri Rabbi Yossi HaGlili. That's Rabbi Yossi HaGlili's opinion, that since bikurim have to specifically be eaten in Jerusalem, so it wouldn't satisfy the direction of the pasuk, which is b'chomosh v'seichem tochlu matzos, that eat matzos wherever you are. And bikurim cannot be eaten anywhere, therefore you can't make matzos out of them, because then those matzos wouldn't be able to be eaten anywhere. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Rabbi Akiva agrees with Rabbi Yossi HaGlili that you'd be unable to use bikurim for matzos. However, he learns it out from a different pasuk. Matzah umar, right? That the pasuk says, "Al matzah sumorim yochluhu." They lead the korban pesach with matzah and mar. So we compare matzah and mar. Mamar shaynu bikurim, af matzah shayni bikurim. Just like mar isn't one of the 7 species and therefore is not subject to bikurim, so therefore matzah also don't make matzah of bikurim. So now the Gemara of course asks, mamar shayn b'mino bikurim, af matzah shayn b'mino bikurim. But one second, not only do you not have mar of bikurim, mar isn't even something that is relevant to bikurim. It's not one of the Shiva Saminim. So I'll say, well, if we're comparing matzah and maror, I would argue that matzah needs to be made from something that is not a bikurim object, i.e., well, we said yesterday that you can make matzahs from wheat, barley, oats, rye, and spelt. Well, of those 5 possibilities, wheat and barley are from the Shiva Saminim, which means that they're subject to bikurim. So I'll make the argument that just like by maror, it's not even subject to bikurim bichlal. So I need to make matzahs from things that aren't subject to bikurim bichlal. I should have to make matzah from spelt, oat, and rye. I shouldn't be able to use wheat or barley. I will therefore exclude wheat and barley, which are subject to bikurim. So tamlomer matzahs riba. So to that, Rabbi Akiva answers and says, no, matzahs riba, as we've seen already. I think we've seen it twice already. I think we saw it yesterday. Yeah, yesterday and today. That matzahs riba, it says matzahs twice to include. What's it coming to include? So we're going to say it's going to include that you can make matzahs even from wheat and barley, which are subject to bikurim. Just make sure that you're not making it from actual wheat and barley that is bikurim. But the Gemara asks, matzahs riba afilu bikurim nami. But Rabbi Akiva, why are you drawing the line there? Right? If we're saying that you're allowed to make matzahs from wheat and from barley, even though they're ingredients that are subject to bikurim, since we have this riboy of matzahs, so we're saying you can even make matzah from wheat and barley, but then why draw the line there? Say matzahs riba, that we're coming to include even bikurim, that you can even make matzahs from mamish bikurim. So the Gemara answers, Hadaber Rabbi Akiva. The Gemara says, wow, it's taka good kasha, and guess what? Rabbi Akiva changed his mind. Rabbi Akiva retracted to actually exclude bikurim like Rabbi Yossi HaGlili. To learn out from b'chomosh v'seichem, tochlu matzos, that you have to eat matzos wherever you are, and bikurim has to be eaten specifically in Jerusalem, therefore you cannot have matzos of bikurim. Okay, how do we know that Rabbi Akiva retracted? Let's see. Titania is learning a brayso yochel yetzi adam yitei chovaso b'bikurim. Is it possible that a person can make matzos with bikurim? It says that you have to, right, that you'll eat matzahs wherever you are. Therefore, matzah needs to be eaten anywhere. Bikurim which therefore excludes bikurim, which are unable to be eaten anywhere. They specifically have to be eaten in Jerusalem. Therefore, you cannot make matzahs from bikurim. Okay, well, if that's the case, listen up. Mayser shayni b'Yerushalayim. We discussed it at the very beginning of the daf. What's mayser shayni b'Yerushalayim? So, I have my field. I don't live in Jerusalem. I live wherever I live. So, and I grow some wheat. So I harvest the wheat. The 2% I give to the Kohen as truma. Take 10%, give it to Levi as mayser. And now in years 1, 2, 4, and 5, I separate mayser shayni, which is another 10%. Right, 2% to the Kohen, 10% to the Levi, and then I take this second 10%, which is mayser shayni, and I bring it to Jerusalem to eat over there. Now here's the interesting thing about mayser shayni. Once I bring this wheat to Jerusalem, I can no longer eat it outside of Jerusalem. Meaning, before I had brought it to Jerusalem, so I can always be poda it onto money, right? I could take the value of this wheat, transfer it onto money, take that money to Jerusalem, and then buy stuff in Jerusalem. However, once this wheat makes it into Jerusalem, this mayser shayni makes it into Jerusalem, I can no longer be poda it. I can no longer transfer its value onto money and then spend the money in Jerusalem. Once this, meaning I'm already in Jerusalem, but once this wheat comes into Jerusalem, it cannot be taken out of Jerusalem. Meaning, let's say I decide that I already brought the wheat to Jerusalem. I want to eat this wheat outside of Jerusalem. I don't know, for whatever reason. Or maybe there's some great mill outside of Jerusalem and you decide you want to take the wheat over there, whatever it might be. Once the wheat comes into Jerusalem, the mayser shayni wheat comes into Jerusalem, it can no longer be taken out and eaten outside of Jerusalem. It must be eaten in Jerusalem. So, therefore, we see that mayser shayni b'Yerushalayim, so meaning whereas when I live outside of Jerusalem and I separate mayser shayni, this wheat, so I can eat it at my house. I just need to transfer its value onto money, put aside that money. As we said, we said it the other day, maybe bury it in the ground, whatever it is. Take this money and I'll bring that to Jerusalem, and now I can eat this mayser shayni, which is now chulin. I can eat it outside of Jerusalem. However, once this wheat is taken, or whatever the product is, but in this case we're saying wheat, is taken into Jerusalem, I can no longer do that. This wheat must be eaten in Jerusalem. It cannot be eaten anywhere else. I can't be poda it. I can't transfer its value onto money and eat it elsewhere. It must be eaten in Jerusalem. And therefore, if mayser shayni b'Yerushalayim must be eaten in Jerusalem, it cannot be taken out, well then it should be just like bikurim, which must be eaten in Jerusalem, and therefore I shouldn't be able to make matzahs from mayser shayni. Which Rabbi Yossi Aglili, of course, earlier said that you'd be unable to make matzahs from mayser shayni, but Rabbi Akiva said that you would. Okay. So we're saying what? So yachol shani motzi af mayser shayni. So is it possible that for the same reason that I exclude bikurim from matzahs, because I have to eat them in Jerusalem, I can't eat them anywhere. So mayser shayni that was brought to Jerusalem also, I shouldn't be able to make matzah because I have to davka eat it in Jerusalem. I can't eat it wherever I want. So tamalomer matzahs riba. Therefore, the pasuk says matzahs, right? This riboy to say that you can even make matzahs from mayser shayni, from flour of mayser shayni, even though you have to eat mayser shayni b'Yerushalayim in Yerushalayim. Umara isa l'rabos mayser shayni lotzi bikurim. Now the Gemara asks, one second. We have one pasuk that says v'chomosh v'seichem tochlu matzahs, that matzah needs to be made from something that you can eat anywhere. And we exclude from that bikurim. And we have a riboy of matzahs, which we say to include mayser shayni, that even though it has to be eaten in Yerushalayim, you're allowed to make matzahs from mayser shayni. How did we choose that b'chomosh v'seichem tochlu matzahs is going to exclude bikurim, and matzahs is going to include mayser shayni? Why don't we flip it around? Why don't we say that b'chomosh v'seichem tochlu matzahs excludes mayser shayni, and matzahs riba includes bikurim? What do you guys say? So the Gemara answers, my ba'ani mayser shayni. The reason why I include mayser shayni, i.e. to say that you're allowed to make matzahs from mayser shayni, is sheyesh lo heter b'chol moshavos k'd Rabbi Eliezer. Well, because actually, technically, there is a way that you'd be able to eat this mayser shayni in Yerushalayim outside of Yerushalayim, like Rabbi Eliezer. Umotzani bikurim, and we'll explain what Rabbi Eliezer is in a minute. Umotzani bikurim shein lo'en heter b'chol moshavos, to the exclusion of, right, and I'll exclude bikurim, which is never going to be eaten outside of Jerusalem. So, meaning, and we'll get to Rabbi Eliezer in a second, but the point is that actually mayser shayni b'Yerushalayim, there is a way that I can eat it outside of Jerusalem, and therefore I can consider it to be b'chol moshvosechem tochlu matzos, whereas bikurim must be eaten in Jerusalem, and there's no way around that, and therefore it's excluded from the pasuk that says b'chol moshvosechem tochlu matzos, that you have to eat matzos anywhere, to the exclusion of bikurim. But matzos riba, we include mayser shayni, since even though yes, mayser shayni b'Yerushalayim has to be eaten in Yerushalayim, there is a way out. And what's the way out? To Amar Rabbi Eliezer minayin mayser shayni shenitma shepodenos afilu b'Yerushalayim. How do we know that mayser shayni that became tameh, I could redeem it onto money, and then that mayser shayni becomes chulin, and then I can eat it? So, and that's even in Jerusalem. Therefore the pasuk says kilo suchal se'eso. In the context of being podeh mayser shayni, it says that you will redeem the mayser shayni. So the simple explanation is kilo suchal se'eso, because you're unable to carry it, all of it, right? Meaning 10% of your field, if you have a big field, it could be a lot of product. So it could be a humongous schlep to bring a truck full of this stuff to Jerusalem. So we say, okay, so just transfer its value onto money. But the way that we want to understand it is kilo tuchal se'eto vein se'es ela achila. Se'es means to eat it. Shene'amar vayisa masos me'es panav. By Yosef HaTzadik, with all the brothers, it says that he gave them all food, and he gave Binyamin 5 times as much. So we see that se'es can also be eating, and therefore you can learn that you can be podeh your mayser shayni because you can't eat it. Meaning, if you're in Jerusalem and you have this mayser shayni food and it becomes tameh, so then you would be allowed, and now you cannot eat it. You can't eat mayser shayni that's tameh, as we said, right? V'lo pi'arti b'menu b'tameh, I think is what it says. I didn't eat it when I was tameh. So in that case, says Rabbi Eliezer, I can actually be podeh, transfer the value of the mayser shayni onto money, and then I can eat the mayser shayni. It's just chulin, and I can eat it wherever I want. So there actually is a way to be able to eat mayser shayni b'Yerushalayim outside of Yerushalayim, and therefore we can consider b'chol moshvosechem. Okay, fine. Nu, so the Gemara says, Man shamas le'da'amar b'mayser shayni nafik bey. So going back to the beginning of today's daf, who's the man da'amar who says that you'd be allowed to make matzahs from mayser shayni? Rabbi Akiva, right? Rabbi Yossi says you're not allowed to make matzahs from mayser shayni because it says lo achalti ba'oni mimeni. No, because it says lechem oni, something that you can even eat ba'aninus. Anyways, Rabbi Akiva says you're allowed to make matzahs from mayser shayni. Okay, which means that he therefore must be the author of this brisa. Aha. And what did the brisa say? How do we know that you are unable to make matzahs out of bikurim? Well, it says b'chol moshvosechem. It has to be eaten, right? So the matzahs have to be able to be eaten anywhere. Bikurim can only be eaten in Jerusalem. So therefore it excludes, right? You can't make matzahs from bikurim. So we see that Rabbi Akiva is excluding bikurim from matzahs from b'chol moshvosechem and not from matzah and maror. So not from the juxtaposition of amatzos maror yochlu. So we see that Rabbi Akiva retracted from his original limud of matzo maror, and instead is learning like Rabbi Yossi Aglili that it's from b'chol moshvosechem tochlu matzos to exclude bikurim, which have to specifically be eaten in Jerusalem. Rabbi Yossi Aglili, tepiklei milechem oni. Now, Rabbi Yossi Aglili, let me ask you a kasha, Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Rabbi Yossi Aglili, how do I know that you're not allowed to make bikurim into matzos? So Rabbi Yossi Aglili said, because it says b'chol moshvosechem tochlu matzos, you have to be able to eat the matzos anywhere. Bikurim you have to eat in Jerusalem. But Rabbi Yossi Aglili, let me ask you a kasha, Rabbi Yossi Aglili. At the beginning of the daf, we said, can you make matzos from mayser shayni b'Yerushalayim? And Rabbi Yossi Aglili, you said, no, you can't. How come? Because it says lechem oni. that it has to be, matzahs have to be able to be eaten even as an onen. Therefore, that excludes mayser shayni, because mayser shayni lo achalti ba'oni mimenu, right? That I didn't eat it when I was an onen. So mayser shayni cannot be eaten as an onen. Therefore, you cannot make matzahs as out of mayser shayni. Why don't we say the same thing by bikurim? Lechem oni. It has to be. You have to be able to eat it as an onen. You can't eat bikurim as an onen. Therefore, from lechem oni, I exclude bikurim. So why does Rabbi Yossi Aglili need to exclude bikurim? Learn it out in the same way that he excludes mayser shayni. That the matzah has to be able to be eaten even as an onen. To the exclusion of bikurim that has to be eaten in rejoicing. Savlak Reb Shimon. So my answer is, well, Rabbi Yossi Aglili holds like Reb Shimon. The Tanya, as we learn in the Brisa, bikurim asur in the onen, that an onen is not allowed to eat bikurim. Reb Shimon matir, and Reb Shimon says that you are allowed to eat bikurim as an onen. My time in the Rabbanon, how come the rabbis say that you're unable to eat bikurim as an onen? The pasuk says, "L'sucha lecha b'sharecha," that we have a pasuk that describes a whole bunch of products. It describes mayser shayni, and it also describes at the end something called utrumas yadecha. Ve'amar Marim, we said trumas yadecha elu bikurim. That's a reference to bikurim. The iskash bikurim the mayser, and therefore we're comparing bikurim to mayser shayni. Mayser also the onen, just like mayser shayni, an onen is not permitted to eat. Af bikurim also the onen. Also bikurim is unable to be eaten by an onen. So therefore the Tanakama says that an onen cannot eat bikurim, and since an onen wouldn't be able to eat bikurim, so then maybe you can make the argument that also not matzahs, but let's not go there. The Tanakama says that a onen cannot eat bikurim. Now, Reb Shimon, according to Reb Shimon, he says, Truma karinu rachmana ketruma. So, Reb Shimon says, yeah, granted that maybe it's a reference to bikurim, truma sedecha is a reference to bikurim, but we're referring to it as truma. Ma truma mutaris laonen af bikurim mutar laonen. Just like truma is allowed to be eaten by an onen, so therefore bikurim can also be eaten by an onen. So we see that according to Reb Shimon, bikurim are allowed to be eaten by an onen, and therefore we're saying that Rabbi Yossi Aglili holds like Reb Shimon, that bikurim can be eaten by an onen, and therefore the pasuk when it says lechem oni, and Rabbi Yossi Aglili learns out that it has to be eaten by aninos, while bikurim can be eaten by aninos, so there's no problem with that. And therefore, how do we know that you're not allowed to eat and make matzahs from bikurim? Because it says b'chol moshvos seichem tochel matzahs, it has to be matzahs that can be eaten anywhere. Reb Shimon, nihi de hekesh leisle, simcha mia michtav ksiva bu, t'chsiv v'samachta b'chol hatov, or the Gemara has a good kasha. Right, let's read it again. Reb Shimon. So Reb Shimon, who says that you're allowed to eat bikurim as an onen, because we compare it to truma, and truma can be eaten as an onen, but nihi de hekesh leisle, so granted that he doesn't compare bikurim to mayser shayni to say that you cannot eat it as an onen, but simcha mia michtav ksiva bu. But what about the fact that by bikurim it mentions rejoicing? That you'll be happy with all the goodness that God has given you. So certainly that should exclude being able to eat bikurim as an onen when you're very sad because a relative died. So when it says that eat it in rejoicing, it doesn't mean, at a time when you're happy, and if you're an onen you can't eat bikurim. No, it means a time of year that is a happy time of year. The Tanan, as we learned in the Mishnah, from Shavuos until Sukkot, you bring your bikurim to Yerushalayim, and you also read the whole thing of Arami Ovid Avi, Vayerd Mitzrayim, etc. And then from Sukkot until Chanukah, so then you could bring the bikurim, but you just don't read all those psukim from the Torah. So we see that bikurim are dafka brought at a specific time of year. The time of year between Shavuos, ideally between Shavuos and Sukkot, that's a time of the harvest, a time when people are happy that, with what they're bringing in the harvest. That's what it means. But it doesn't mean on the micro level that, it has to be on a day when you're happy that you can't, to exclude eating bikurim as an onen. Reb Shimon says that that's not the case. And therefore, Rabbi Yossi Aglili holds like Reb Shimon that bikurim is able to be eaten as an onen, and therefore, so how do we know that you are not allowed to make matzahs from bikurim, from chomash v'seichem tochlu matzahs, to exclude bikurim which must be eaten specifically in Jerusalem? Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, lechem oni, okay, it has to be poor man's bread. Prat lechalot v'la'ashisha, to the exclusion of some kind of bread that's made with, like, I don't know, scalding somehow. It seems like there's all sorts of opinions about what this is, but I don't know, maybe like a bagel, maybe, I don't know, some kind of scalded bread. With ashisha, or like a very big, mechubad, humongous bread. Don't make matzahs from that either. Well, then is it possible that the only thing you could use for matzahs is like shvache, coarse matzahs? As it says, lechem oni, it has to be poor man's bread, right? It should have to be very downtrodden, very rough bread. Tamalomar, matzahs riba, vafilu kumatzahs shashlomo. Therefore the pasuk says matzahs, says matzahs twice to include, even bread made out of like fine flour, even like Shlomo HaMelech, what his bread must have been like. So you can make matzahs from fine flour, but just don't scald it, or don't make it absolutely humongous, but you can make very delicious matzahs. Okay. So what do we exclude from poor man's bread? Prat lechalutin v'la'ashisha, to the exclusion of what we said earlier, this scalded bread or this humongous, like matzahs. How do we know that ashisha is a very mechubad, very fancy bread? Tichsiv, as the pasuk says, by David HaMelech, when he brought the Aron to Jerusalem, it says, Vayichalek l'chol ha'am, that he gave out to everybody, to the entire nation, l'chol hamon Yisrael, to all of Israel, l'meish v'ad isha, from man to woman, Leish chalas lechem achas, to each person he gave this really big bread. Ve'eshbar echad, and one eshbar, v'ashisha achas begomer, and one ashisha. V'amar of Chanan bar Abba, eshbar echad mishisha bepar. An eshbar is 1/6 of a cow. That's a lot of freaking meat. Ashisha echad mishisha be'efa, and an ashisha is 1/6 of an ephah, which is like a humongous challah. Apparently it's like one of those, I was learning with my friend yesterday, he explained that it was basically like, I don't know, like one of those, like the Rebbe shechalos, those like really, really big challahs. So like every person got one of those. They're like the size of a person. Or maybe not quite that big, but big. So we see that's how we know that an ashisha is a very geshmake bread. Okay? And this argues on Shmuel, the Amr Shmuel, ashisha gar b'lechamr. Okay, Shmuel says that an ashisha is actually some kind of container of wine. Ohave ashishe anavim, people who love containers of wine. All right, containers of wine sounds very nice. All right, well, that was Daf Lamed Vav of Masechta Pesachim, Daf 36. So what did we learn? Who could tell me? You know what? I'm not going to do the review today. I want somebody else to do the review. Who wants to do the review? All right. We discussed matzah from mayser shayni in Jerusalem. So, are you allowed to make matzahs from mayser shayni? So, Rabbi Yossi Aglili says, no, you cannot, because lechem oni, it has to be something you can even eat as an onen. You can't eat mayser shayni as an onen. Rabbi Akiva says, yes, you can, because I think he learned it out from matzahs riba, right? So that it says matzahs, even to include mayser shayni. So what does he do with lechem oni? He said it means poor man's bread. It's poor man's bread, and it excludes dough that's made with like oil, wine, and honey. And the fact that it's red oni is that it's a matzah. It's matzah that you say all sorts of things about, like the Haggadah and Halo. Then we got into the sugya of matzah from dough kneaded with wine, oil, or honey. So Rabbi Gamliel says that this dough must be burnt immediately because it is highly chametzi, right? It can become chametz very quickly. Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, i.e. the Chachamim, they say that you would be allowed to eat it. But we basically conclude that you would be allowed to eat this matzah not on the first night of Pesach, where it says lechem oni, it has to be poor man's bread, but from then on, you'd be allowed to eat matzah that is kneaded with oil, wine, or honey. Very interesting. Then we got into the sugya about matzah of bikurim. Can you eat matzah made from bikurim? The answer is no. We saw different ways to learn it out. Rabbi Yosef Glili learns it out from you have to be able to eat matzah anywhere. Initially, Rabbi Akiva had learned it out from matzah umarer, right, to compare them, but we ended up saying that Rabbi Akiva also retracted to hold like Rabbi Yosef Glili, to learn it out from B'chomosh v'seichem tochlu matzahs. And then at the end, we got into machlokas about eating bikurim as an onin. Machlokas the Chachamim and Rabbi Shimon. The Chachamim says that you're not allowed to eat bikurim as an onin, because we compare bikurim to mayser shayni. You cannot eat mayser shayni as an onin. And Rabbi Shimon says that you are allowed to eat bikurim as an onin, because it's written trumas yadecha. Bikurim are referred to as trumas yadecha. Just like truma you can eat as an onin, so also mayser, therefore also bikurim you can eat as an onin. Okay, well, chevra, that was Daf Lamed Vav. Peace out.